Hi, thank you for letting me join you this way. I wish I could be there in person. Thank you as well for hosting this event, as well as for hosting my colleagues from Veterans for Peace. Been asked to speak a little bit about status of force agreement. I also want to speak a little bit too about the agreements that Japan is entering into with the United States, as well as with other nations and organizations like NATO, that I feel are akin to the status of forces agreement in terms of what Japan is giving up and of what dangers that puts Japan in. I look at this and I think of the first president of the United States, George Washington, who in his farewell address warned of the dangers of permanent alliances. And I think as well of Thomas Jefferson, the third president and the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who warned of the dangers of entangling alliances. So this hesitation, this warning, this fear of alliances dominated the thoughts of the early American leaders. And I think for good cause, and I think they have for good reason as well, their own experiences as well as what history taught them. I think you look at the status of forces agreement that you've had with the United States since 1960, that has really abrogated, really limited, really diminished Japan's sovereignty. You have a system in place that allows for a foreign military to dictate what occurs within the population, within the communities, and also, so importantly, what happens to the environment. And so you can see all sorts of examples, and I'm sure you'll hear some tonight, and I'm sure you're very well aware of many, probably more aware than I am, of course. But this idea that whatever the United States military does, to a large degree, is of its own responsibility, that there is no accountability for it. So whatever the United States military does on its bases, and I think it's focusing, say, on the environment, is very important and very illustrative of this, right? Whatever the United States military does on its bases, it's not accountable for. So whatever the United States military puts into the air, whether from emissions, from incineration, from pollution, from combustion, et cetera, corrosion, that is of no, there's no ability for the Japanese public to not just regulate it, to be aware of it. And this goes as well as what goes into the water, what gets discharged into the water, what gets discharged into the ground. So what's leaking into the water table, what's leaking into and throughout your soil. Someone who was in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I was stationed in Okinawa for nearly 3 years. Example I can give you is the red clay issue. So you would have our vehicles, or we would take our vehicles into the training areas. They would get that red clay on them. They would come back, and we were supposed to follow certain requirements for ensuring that the red clay would not run off into the ocean, because that's the danger there, that you're going to have this red clay contaminating the ocean and the beaches. And what would happen? We come back and we wash the vehicles, and sure enough, a lot of that would run off into the oceans. And there was nothing the Japanese could do about it. There's nothing the Japanese authorities or the Japanese public, were able to do on any of the U.S. military bases in terms of ensuring that environmental standards are being kept, that harm wasn't being done to the environment, and that pollutants weren't being introduced into the air, into the land, to the water, that would have not just a immediate effect on the population, but that would have a long-term effect. And so giving up that sovereignty puts the Japanese people into danger, because the interests of the U.S. military are not the interests of the Japanese people. And the U.S. military is always going to put its interests first over those of the Japanese public. And that's the same for wherever the United States is around the world with its 800 military bases. The primary concern, the first interest, is always going to be what is best for the U.S. military. In a similar vein, by entering into these international agreements, just recently, the leaders of Japan, the United States, and South Korea met You have other agreements between the United States, Japan, and Australia. Certainly, those fall into a larger set of agreements that the United States has, these alliances throughout Asia. And then, of course, you have the relationship that Japan has with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Japan has had an ambassador to NATO for a number of years. Prime Minister of Japan, your Prime Minister, just attended the big NATO summit back in July. There's talk of NATO opening an office in Japan. But of course, it is a partner of NATO through these ITPPs, these individually tailored partnership programs. And so that allows the Japanese to give up a degree of sovereignty. Because if you have a relationship with one nation, and then you have a relationship with the other nations, and then you're bound by some form of agreement that whatever happens, you must adhere to the agreement. And you extend those agreements through a number of countries, through a number of different relationships, through a number of different alliances. What happens is that any chain of events, almost like dominoes falling, can pull Japan into a crisis, into a conflict, into a war of which it has no interest. And of course, we have seen this become more and more of an issue over the last 25 years, especially the last 10 years, as the United States and NATO have confronted China. You see Japan being pulled into that, just as, say, the Philippines are, Vietnam, Australia, South Korea, et cetera. So the United States has an agreement going back to 1951 with Philippine Islands that is a mutual defense treaty, which says that if the Philippines are attacked, that will be as if it was an attack on the United States. And because the United States has this agreement with the Philippines, which then extends the Japanese into that agreement to a degree, because they have certain security agreements with the United States. And the same goes, say, for South Korea, the same goes for Australia. And then, of course, if you're going to enter into a partnership with NATO, that now puts you into an alliance, a pseudo-alliance or a quasi-alliance, at least, with countries in Europe on the other side of the globe. So those kinds of things, that giving up that sovereignty, it's just not a philosophical or political issue or danger. It's a very real danger, because what it can do is it can pull you into things. It can cause consequences that you don't foresee, just as, say, giving up your internal sovereignty through a status of forces agreement. And just in the one example, again, with the environment, but certainly other examples of a loss of sovereignty through status of forces agreement, you enter into dangers that may not be apparent right now, but certainly will come down the line, such as the inherent pollutants, the inherent toxic legacy of any military. So what you deal with then is a destruction of the environment that isn't just immediate, but is long-term and has very severe public and environmental health consequences. So I wanted to touch on those things. I wanted to make sure that this idea that these were interlinked, the idea of the status forces agreement is interlinked with the this real big push to get Japan into these alliances, to have a real relationship, a real connection to NATO, and how that, of course, is very dangerous for the Japanese public. I don't think it serves their interests. It only serves to heighten the tensions in the region, and is certainly not moving the region and the world forward towards any form of peace and prosperity. So I want to end it there, but I want to thank you all again for allowing me to speak with you, and thank you for hosting this event, as well as hosting my colleagues from Veterans for Peace. Thank you.